Hi there. Welcome to my webinar of integrity as a product manager. I wanted to talk today to you about what it means to be a product manager in such a field, especially as I think it is something that is not quite common and it is quite a rare position that is quite core to a lot of companies. Trust and safety is something that is taken seriously by many around the world. And so I wanted to highlight and shine a bit of information of what there could be in this role to educate you and to show you what happens. My name is Dan. I'm a product manager here at Bumble. And so I'd like to just talk to you a bit more about integrity. I want to give a small background about myself, what I did, how I've ended up where I was, and then going into the integrity role itself. I originally have a computer science background, always sort of working in the privacy area, where my bachelor's dissertation was looking at privacy and instant messages and access control policies to make sure you didn't send wrong messages to unintended audience members. My thesis was looking at friends to delete and recommending them from your Facebook network to look at scalable privacy. After this, I was a program manager in the Microsoft News team, where I was looking after internal tooling for our editorial workforce worldwide to help them automate and empower their day-to-day works and content choosing, as well as automating some of their tasks using ML and working with data science. I'm now located at Bumble, where I work in the integrity team, where I look after the visual moderation and all things verification flows on the platform. In this talk, I want to explain to you what is integrity and where it sort of originates from. Would like to discuss to you the problem areas and give an example of the abuse that could be witnessed and could be thought about whenever introducing features, the skill set and the differences between an integrity PM and more perhaps the classic PM role that people would be more aware about, and as well as diving a little bit into the mindset that goes into thinking about this and giving you some tips potentially of how to consider this role if this is of interest, and as well as just things to consider. And then I'll just wrap this all up. So what is integrity? Integrity is something that is to do with trust and safety and preventing abuse for the end user. Normally, this starts with things such as spam and is being looked at by an engineer, but there are some certain examples that you would be aware of. If we take the examples on social networks, such as reporting and blocking users and giving feedback to the platform, as well as the most common one, spam in everybody's email. I'm not sure if anybody has not received spam, but this is quite a common one of abuse that can be witnessed. And as well as in areas such as in banking and finance, where you need to know your customer to make sure they are a real person who will be using their services and that there's no abuse visible on there. So integrity is quite diverse and exists in a lot of places. And it is our job to always think about users' trust and safety and how to prevent abuse and help them to stay safe. Now, the problem areas that you will face in integrity will very much depend on the scale and the size of the company that you are at. Normally, this starts off with maybe in a small startup where you have a few engineers and the founders. And as you develop your solutions, the engineer may notice sort of strange patterns and behaviors, which is not expected or is abusing the system that it was intended. And so they will create some patches and fix some things. But then as the business grows and there's more features, the amounts of functionality that could be abused would also grow. And so then rather than it being patching, they may start becoming services that need to facilitate this to be ongoing and battling these issues until you could become almost a hugely successful and a hugely popular app that will deal with all sorts of types of abuse that will require dedicated teams to deep dive and understand all these nuances, all the ways business logic could be circumnavigated, and all the ways that we would still need to propagate safety to the users. So the problem areas definitely vary based on the size of the company you're at and at which stage it is at. So I want to just work through a small example just to give some ideas of how this problem area can grow. So let's take an example of a very simple app. Here, you can just log in and post all photos for all the users to see. Now, I already can see potentially a few areas of abuse that could occur. There are cases where you can have a breaking into accounts where the person will be trying to abuse the password system that you have. There could also be problems around the types of images being shared if you haven't specified what should and shouldn't be shared, which may cause harm to people and may make it toxic without you intending to. Now, let's assume that the app continues growing and some new features are developed, such as commenting on photos. There is still another possibility for abuse here. Imagining abusive comments, harassment, bullying. There could be links allowed into the commentary. What if this link takes you to an unintended site or somewhere away from your platform where you cannot look after your user? What about images and comments? What would then be seen there would be the same issues as seen in the first part. And some things such as multi-level marketing schemes where people try to recruit people into their own organizations, or even things that have been quite popular as recently as misinformation and what people are saying and believing at face value. These is just some abuse that could happen. Now let's assume we decide to deal with it by creating community guidelines and setting up our customer support. Now we would think that this is all covered and dealt with, but there are still more problems that will arise. How do we know that all the reports are genuine? How do we know people are not ganging up on somebody who doesn't agree with them or wants them to be gotten rid of from the platform? And also, similar to how there may be with any service, with a denial of service attack, where somebody spams infinitely to your service to deny anybody else to access it. What would happen if you suddenly have an infinite amount of reports coming in? How would the operational side actually manage to deal with the cases that do matter and to get to them at a timely matter? Now, let's assume this is all going well and everything is fine, and the app becomes extremely popular. Now, due to the size and popularity with a large, thriving user base, there are still more problems that will happen because of this. There may be fake accounts. People are trying to pass off as one another, trying to make them believe what they are, stealing the photos of other users to make it show that it is them. And if you have any sort of emailing systems or channels to CRM with your users, you might get phishing emails, which will ask you to try and reset your password or whatever not, to essentially try and steal these credentials from the users, sort of like the fake e-commerce emails one may receive in your inbox. Now, again, let's assume that we've dealt with all of this and whatever not, and we go back to launching a very new core capability that we can now share videos. We've dealt with everything else above, but again, there is still more abuse that can happen. What are the contents of the video? This is no longer a single frame. This is now many frames back to back, and we don't know what may be viewed by the user. And also, another problem now will arise is the audio of the videos. You might have silent videos, but you still need to check. Or you could have videos that are just of a black screen, and then the audio itself happens to violate the community guidelines that you have set out. How will you do this, and how will the customer support handle this, and everything else? Now, hopefully this has shown quite clearly that as the number of features increases, so do the vectors of abuse. And this is what you always have to think about, is that anything new will always result in new ways for it to be abused, not in the way that it was intended. So now that we've talked about the kind of problem spaces that could be faced by people, I think it's quite important to not just talk about what areas there are of concern and what you should be thinking about, but as well as the skill set that goes behind it. Now, most of you might be familiar with this diagram, which describes what a PM's role is, sitting at the intersection of UX, technology, and business, and trying to solve for the user's cases to give them delightful experiences to drive the growth and the usage so that people come to your business for whatever purpose it exists. Now, these skills can be broken down into some of these well-known ones, such as design sprinting, interviewing your users, testing with the user the designs that you want to propose to make sure that everything makes sense, planning your roadmap, maybe doing some analysis and defining your success metrics, and prioritizing everything that you will do in this one area to make sure that it is ultimately serving the user and the business needs. Now, whilst there are definitely overlaps in similar skills that somebody in integrity would need, there are some differences. Primarily, as an integrity product manager, you may not have direct control of the user-facing experience, and so you would not be required to look at that. And likewise, there may be other areas that you would need to support. So you wouldn't only need to think about a single area of user-facing experience, but you might have to deal with many of them. And due to the nature of the problem space that we are dealing with, which makes it a very technical one, there will also inherently have to be some technical knowledge that you will learn along the way or be required to understand in order to really accelerate the solution spaces and the services that you provide in order to protect users' safety. And if we think about also the types of metrics that a classic PM might be interested in, they're very much focused on the business metrics, such as monthly active users, daily active users, the conversion rate of the user along the funnel, as well as the retention rate and the churn, as well as the satisfaction score of the users. Now, all these metrics are extremely important to have a healthy and happy business, and this is not a definitive list by any means. But from the fact that in integrity that we don't have the control of the user-facing aspect, but we just need to protect the trust and safety, there is other metrics that we would care about. Things such as accounts blocked. How much content do we remove within a certain time frame if it is reported by a user? How many items or abuse is being stopped automatically such that people don't even experience it? What are people's trust and safety perceptions of the platform itself? And also maybe another metric would be interesting, such as how many people view bad content or accounts before they're dealt with. Now, these metrics almost seem like they're counteracting one another. We have monthly active users, daily active users, yet we're blocking accounts and removing content. So would people not be as happy? Now, there's a fine balance to strike here. And it's important to remember that by removing the abuse and the bad content, if we so will call it, it actually would create a better experience for the users. And so should help drive the NPS score and should help drive the monthly active users and daily active users because people are having that clean experience. But this isn't the way that we look at it. It's almost two sides of the same coin. And this is a good way to think about it. So I want to kind of give you some tips of how to practice these skills or how to think about them if you're interested in this area. And also maybe if you haven't thought about it or want to think about it, to give you some guidelines. So how can we start thinking about this? Rather than coming up with a simple example earlier, there's some actually very nice materials that you can access. A lot of big companies publish their community guidelines. And so this is a fantastic source to try and think, how would you solve for these problematic areas that they have defined? And even more so, maybe they haven't defined something yet that you think is a problem. How would you define that? And how would you know what you'd want to try and stop? Another thing to maybe consider is looking at your favorite app and thinking, how could I abuse this system? Edge cases is something that we always need to think about. So if we take the example of know your customer workflow on a banking application, where you would need to submit a selfie of yourself along with an ID photo, we need to check if the selfie photo actually has a person in it or not. What if I'm taking the photo of the ceiling instead? And these are the types of abuse where have they been thought of to make sure that they do not manage to get through. Another thing to think about is, what if an app launches a feature without enabling something that you thought was so amazing and would really be a game changer? Is there a reason why they didn't do this, apart from maybe wanting to build more hype around it? Is there potentially unforeseen abuse that they haven't yet made ready solutions for, and so they have to wait until that is in place? And the last one to really think about is measurements. Data is really important. The scale and size of these problems, as well as understanding what are your metrics to succeed and to know that you're dealing with this. A lot of the times, this will be quite small cohorts and a maybe rather large user base. And so you need to really define and create these metrics to understand what is happening. I listed some earlier, but I'm sure you could try and come up with some of your own. So some tips for this. Always start small and expand. Think about that example with the app. There's always one way that something could be abused until we could start covering it in an easy solution. But then we would maybe have to develop more advanced solutions if the abuse continued to circumnavigate our initial measures. The other one is ranking the severity of potential abuse. As in an app, you might want to prioritize the key features that you think would be useful for a user. We similarly would need to rank the types of abuse that we see and which ones do we need to cover first, because some might be legally causing, others might be just unpleasant to the user and really cause a horrible experience. And so we need to keep this in mind as well when choosing how we want to go about solving the problems. The same goes for measuring the solution and measuring the scale of the abuse before and after we deploy the solution. This is an important step because always we need to be able to measure and explain what has happened. Because just because we've blocked an extra 200 users, well, were these the correct blocks? Were these users actually doing something wrong? Or do we do it before they even did anything wrong based on other behavioral patterns? It's very important to define these things because that will also help you choose what solution you would go for. And lastly, it's also to think about the types of stakeholders you would include on this journey to try and propose these solutions. There's quite a difference depending on the scale and maturity of the company, as well as the problem areas that you'd solve. It would change also the stakeholders that you bring along with you. Naturally, you would have to work with engineering as your technical counterpart in order to be able to solve these solutions and build these services out. And then there's also potentially the designers need to be involved in case you have to add more reasons for a reporting flow. You always will need to bring the data analysts in to make sure that we can actually measure this truthfully and that it is a robust way that we are doing it. If it's large enough, you have a customer support team, you maybe need to update them on what solutions you're changing and how they need to act differently in order to help support these cases. You might have a policy team as well. And so a policy might need to be changed because you were not truthful to it before, or because people managed to get around it. Likewise, you might have legal in terms of how you're using the data and making sure that you're being compliant in these jurisdictions. And lastly, working with other product managers. If a customer-facing product manager wanted to launch a new feature, such as the video sharing in our example, you would be working with them in order to define the potential vectors of abuse, raising it, prioritizing it, and trying to solve it with them to make sure that there's a healthy, successful launch for the feature and accepting risks that you would not cover if you cannot. Communication here will be key for everything. So to sum up, really, integrity is a rule that protects users' trust and safety. It is always our job to try and think actively about the types of issues that could arise, the risks that we are exposing ourselves to, as well as communicating this to all relevant people such that we are always on the same page about how we should proceed best. And making sure that we always start with a small solution and not over engineering, because maybe there is no problem, but we need to be ready to cover ourselves in case there is. And there is the ways of working reactively as well as working proactively for these solutions. And lastly, users come to your platform for the experience that they are expecting. This is why they are there. But there will always be a cohort which will try to undermine this. And so for the greater good, we try to keep everybody enjoying the experience that they are receiving. I hope this has been a useful short insight into the world of integrity and product management in it, and some of the differences that there are. Thank you for coming today and for your time. And if you have any questions or you'd like to connect, please reach out on LinkedIn. And also, I hope you have a nice day. Thank you.